Apart from such methods of obtaining information, which are infinite and range right across human activity, history is now interpreted with the aid of theories of explanation, explaining the organization and functioning of societies. Historians, therefore, are in dialogue with other social scientists. The public perception of history has yet to be made aware of the fact that the divide today is between historians trained in interdisciplinary research and techniques of investigation, and distinct from them, the array of amateurs, quite untrained, who claim to be historians. Education based on critical inquiry at university level would enable the non-specialist to recognize reasoned arguments and separate them from myth. Methods of critically examining texts can sometimes lead to new departures in disciplines. This is how, over the years, the importance of something like oral history emerged as a sub-discipline of history and literature, adding another dimension to the understanding of the past. For example, the oral records of the Bantu people, once dismissed as fiction, are now being meticulously analyzed and, where possible, used to reconstruct African history. Inevitably, when new theories are proposed, controversies abound. They can only be resolved by fresh evidence or academic debates. Controversy between scholars and polemicists are more frequent in the public space, and some are linked to political ideologies. In India, some controversy has hinged on historical interpretation and is tied into issues of national identity. In the USSR, the claim to alter genes by Lysenko was hinged to genetics. In the USA, the Scopes monkey trial involved attacks on Darwin's theory of evolution. In such situations, textbooks are the victim. Ideally, they should be left to professionals, but instead, all kinds of people intervene. Different political parties with dissimilar ideologies often form the government. Some advocate interference in the content of education, where the aim is not searching for knowledge, but ideological reasons for controlling what people think. So when the political party governing India changes, the history textbooks used in central state schools also change. An array of non-historians, among whom are politicians, bureaucrats, and their hangers-on, as well as diverse religious enterprises that have nothing whatsoever to do with historical research, demand the inclusion of their views in the textbooks. One wishes that they would stay within their own jurisdiction of marketing religions and garnering votes, and leave the control over the contents of education to those professionally qualified to do so. This is why many of us argued 10 years ago that the National Council for Education, Research and Training, the NCERT, that produces textbooks, or the councils of research in various disciplines, should be autonomous organizations under the control of academics specializing in the specific subject. But alas, no one in authority responded to this suggestion. In a seemingly contradictory manner, the past as we envision it, is often sought to give shape to the present. Political ideologies seeking to establish particular identities resort to interpreting knowledge to support the identity. This is then linked to their reading of nation and nationalism, of democracy, and of secular society, all of which are central to our public life. We have therefore to understand that the concepts have to be analyzed and debated. Fundamental to such discussion is the right to information and the right to question. Rights are actually what nurture citizenship. The right to information is crucial to public life. Questions have to be asked to obtain information. Raising questions, therefore, is not anti-national, as is being maintained by some. Questioning is at the root of the thinking process. It was the questions of Socrates that initiated Greek philosophical discourse. It was the questions of the Buddha, the Charvaka thinkers, and some of the rishis of the Upanishads, and all the many others who asked endless questions and whose questions enriched Indian thought, and that is the thought that we acclaim today. It is often said that there is a distinction between pre-modern and modern education, that questioning what is written in the texts was alien to pre-modern education. This is a generalization often made stemming from only the orthodox traditions that discouraged new questions. Established institutions propagating a particular religion socialized the young into that religion. They did not always encourage the questioning of existing knowledge. Their preferred form of teaching, and this is not in any one religion, but the whole lot, their preferred form of teaching was one where predetermined questions were given predetermined answers, and both were memorized. Questions were confined to the learned few. The appropriate religious body of each religion controlled the content of education in its institutions. Deviations or alternate inquiries were not encouraged. Yet, critical inquiry can suggest new ways of exploring ideas, even those relating to religion and society, and they may be more apposite for our times today. However, despite the authoritative conventional beliefs of the upper castes and the elite, there was no shortage of breakaway sects and persons that questioned these beliefs. They were interested in new aspects of knowledge and proclaimed alternate avenues to social organization. Various Shramanic groups of Buddhists, Jains, Ajivakas, Charvakas, and such like questioned Brahmanical beliefs. They were therefore dismissed by the more orthodox as Nastika or non-believers. This duality of the Brahman and the Shraman dharmas, the two dharmas, continued for 1500 years. This is something we all like to forget in our desire to reconstruct a unified past. It is referred to in many texts until the early 2nd millennium AD and regarded as characteristic of Indian religion and thought. The grammarian Patanjali refers to the two dharmas as hostile to each other, and he compares their relationship, interestingly, to that of the snake and the mongoose. The last 1,000 years have been particularly rich in the growth of religious and philosophical sects, especially in Hinduism and Islam, a very crucial period of efflorescence and development. The founders of the sects ranged across a social and religious spectrum and included women, Dalits, and lower castes, earlier excluded from Vedic Brahmanism. Some sects were dedicated to a particular deity. Most others broke the boundaries of the formal religions and illuminated the overlapping areas between them, and in the interstices, thus questioning earlier conventional knowledge. Their questioning, was not necessarily a critical inquiry as we understand it today, but more of a probing into conventional knowledge and suggesting alternatives. We tend to project these sects merely as manifestations of a particular religion. we ignore the fact that as late as the 14th century, a compendium of Indian philosophical schools, the Sarvadarshana Sangraha, begins with a chapter on the Charvak or Lokayata School. This was an earlier school of free thought, drawing on rational arguments, which, despite the opposition from conventional sources, continued into much later times. Histories of philosophy written in the last century tend to give it short shrift. Yet, the author of this compilation, writing in the 14th century, Madhavacharya, states that although he personally did not subscribe to the Lokayata philosophy, others did, and so it had to be given recognition. Scholars have pointed to the existence of a long tradition of rational thinking and inquiry in India. This was to be expected, as such traditions are always present in cultures with strong centers of philosophical thought, as was the Indian. We need to see this tradition in historical context and use it in educational curricula. It is a heritage from the past that points to thought-provoking perspectives, challenging the ones that we constantly quote. It also illustrates what I mean by the content of education having to be defined by professionals and scholars in respective fields. Few non-professionals are aware of this philosophical tradition of logic and rationality. And even if they are, they hesitate to make it a part of an intellectual stream. We have been so imprinted with the idea that the Indian tradition was largely resistant to rational thought. Therefore, now there will be those who would oppose incorporating logic, rationality, and inquiry into the educational curriculum, as there are equally others very keen to pursue it. And above all, this would be so pertinent to interpreting the world around us at the moment. A concern with the contents of education also means giving serious consideration to communicating through the language of instruction and using it for this purpose, the language that is conducive to the discussion of knowledge. Whatever the policy may be, the practice is that in most parts of the country today, the regional language is increasingly being used. The more ambitious people, however, wish to know English, both for its expansive intellectual world and as a valuable qualification for employment. We end up with using the regional language in the main. English is used in such a way that it hardly provides any intellectual appetite, except, of course, in elite schools. This condition could be changed, given that we have always used more than one language and each language in different ways. Let me just look at it historically. Looked at historically, the variation is interesting. The Harappan language is so far unknown, but it would have been used in northwestern India. A few centuries later, there were 3 languages concurrently in use. 2 were from the Indo-Aryan group. 1 was Vedic Sanskrit, and Panini differentiates from the Sanskrit used in the Vedic language and in non-Vedic texts. Grammatical and linguistic works and etymologies of great brilliance, still acknowledged, were written on Sanskrit from the 1st millennium BC onwards. The need for grammars and etymologies suggests that Sanskrit was diversifying, probably due to the presence of other languages, and needed rules to embed its structure, and that it had to be taught to non-Sanskrit speakers. The other Indo-Aryan language was the far more widely spoken Prakrit. Buddhist and Jain texts were composed in Pali and Prakrit. both languages of the Indo-Aryan family, but different from Sanskrit. Prakrit was used extensively in inscriptions, as in those of Ashok Maurya and other rulers. It was a language used by women and Shudras, who together, therefore, formed the majority of the population. We tend to forget that. Sanskrit became the language of governance, particularly with the coming of dynasties from Central Asia around the Christian era, who issued inscriptions in Sanskrit rather than Prakrit. Subsequent to this, it became the court language, the language of administration and the language of upper caste males. It remained so for a millennium. Inevitably, it was the main language of learning. Texts on secular subjects were written in Sanskrit, ranging from mathematics, astronomy, and medicine to philosophy, aesthetics, literature, and an array of commentaries on the social codes, epics, and other subjects. Buddhist and Jain authors also wrote their texts, began writing their texts in Sanskrit from this time on. Parallel to Indo-Aryan was Dravidian, the second language group and current in peninsular India. That there were languages other than Sanskrit, even in northern India, is clear from references in Sanskrit texts to people who speak their own language, such as the largely incomprehensible Chandal Bhasha, and others, the Mleccha, who cannot speak Sanskrit correctly. Tamil was important in South India from the latter part of the first millennium BC, and some degree of Prakrit was also known. Sanskrit was a later arrival here. If the Adivasi presence went back to this period, as some scholars assert, then languages such as Munda would also have been spoken. What has recently been described as the Sanskrit cosmopolis, other languages notwithstanding, was established in the mid-first millennium AD. The other languages were the associated Prakrit, and still later the evolving Apabhramsha, not to mention the Dravidian languages of the peninsula. The primacy of Tamil in the south and the emergence of Telugu and Kannada took form in the Dravidian language areas. In North India, the derivatives of Indo-Aryan were also diversifying into a variety of languages by the early second millennium AD. Much cited Sanskrit texts were adapted into new forms in Tamil, Hindi, and Bengali, at least. The Sufis of North India and the Mughals wrote in Hindi, apart from other languages such as Persian, the language of the learned and of the court. At the Mughal court, there was active collaboration between Brahmin and Jain Sanskrit scholars supervising the translation of major Sanskrit texts into Persian. Braj Bhasha was common to some northern courts, such as Awadh, and to popular culture in the region. Then came European trading companies, bringing Portuguese, French, and English, Portuguese and French surviving in some pockets. English, as the language of governance and power, became common to the emergent middle classes, used together with the regional languages. If occupation was one factor in the segregation of castes, English education has been described as playing a similar role in segregating classes. As the language of communication, it reached out to larger numbers than had Sanskrit, since Shudras and women were not excluded from learning English. Specialized knowledge in the sciences, philosophy, and the early social sciences was taught in English. Soon, the literary articulation of the middle class, both in poetry and prose, was to include English, in addition to the regional language. The language of knowledge, historically then, changed from Prakrit to Sanskrit to Persian and then to English. So what is the situation now, and what is the future of the local language and of English, what some people call Indian English? If English is linked to the advance of knowledge, if we argue that, then it has to be known and known well. All languages associated with knowledge have to be known. The correct and precise use of a language is crucial to research in all branches of learning. There's no getting around this. There are no easy ways of saying, I'll learn a simple language. It has to be done the hard way. Knowledge of the language in which a particular subject was being researched was necessary to research, even in past times. For example, advances in mathematics and astronomy were possible because scholars in these fields were familiar with works in Arabic and Sanskrit. Arab scholars had translated Greek texts, and they also acknowledged the expertise of Indian scholars in mathematics. They were doubtless familiar with Sanskrit texts, apart from the language of signs, as for instance in algebra, as part of mathematics. Working with contemporary knowledge means knowing its language. This applies to the social sciences as much to other sciences. In the Indian subcontinent, no language had the monopoly of being the only one used at any time for every purpose. There was always diffusion in the function of various languages, and I'm deliberately underlining the idea of the function of a language. Left to itself, that is what is likely to happen now. But it can be made more effective if a properly worked out system is adopted. So what should be the language of instruction? To know 3 languages sufficiently to make even impolite conversation is not a problem. To know each language well enough to use it in fundamental research is problematic. Generally, one is the preferred language. I would therefore argue that a student should know 2 languages really well. Initially, it has to be the language of his or her socialization into the family and society. Subsequently comes the language of knowledge, and one language may not fit all. It might therefore make some sense, and this is a suggestion I'm throwing out, if we were to opt for a slightly modified but deliberate bilingual formula. We begin with the language of socialization at primary school, the mother tongue or the regional language, the language of childhood, of imagination, of poetry, and of much else that comes later. Just prior to secondary school, English could be introduced as the additional medium together with the first language. If some subjects are taught bilingually, they might be better understood by students. That would certainly enrich both languages. By the end of secondary school, a student should be able to use both languages with relative ease. Education today is increasingly given in the regional language, with little emphasis on training in English, required even as just an additional language. Knowledge is being reduced to what is available in only one local language. Translations never keep up to date with new knowledge. The danger is also that communication between Indians may decrease. In recent years, we have had market forces edging out the humanities in favor of disciplines linked to the market economy, its technologies, and to science. This is a problem facing the best universities the world over, what is referred to as the death of liberal education at universities. Giving priority is understandable, but utilitarian value should not be the sole criterion of education. If the Indian genius expressed itself in grammatical works, This was partly because language was not an obstacle, but was used creatively. Many languages coexisted, as I've tried to show, emanating from different social strata and regions, being used for different activities, and were communicated through osmosis in the proximity of two or more languages. The advantage of a bilingual education is that both languages borrow concepts from each other and thereby take on extended functions. I would like to conclude by reiterating what I have been arguing for, that the content of education has to give priority to what is called critical inquiry. This I would like to emphasize and underline as strongly as I can. By this I mean teaching students to feel liberated enough to ask questions about the world they live in, and to question knowledge in a systematic, logical, reasoned manner that might well give them new insights into their world. This may release the potential of not only those that are first-generation learners, but also of others having to learn out-of-date knowledge that they, in any case, are not permitted to question, as is often the case today. A different kind of education may well lead to the discovery of new knowledge to be properly appropriated. It is only then that education can help in changing mindsets for the better. Values have to be experienced and nurtured. Where values are imposed, they tend to wither away. And if a bilingual education can also be implemented, then there can be a greater comprehension of the participation of you and me in the world. The world will open up to many more than just the few, and that surely is what education is all about. Thank you.